We are talking to Sam Cleaves, the Principal Regional Planner at the Metropolitan Planning Council, and Jack Clarke, Director of Public Policy and Government Relations at Mass Audubon. Gentlemen, could you talk about the implications, if any, of air pollution on the coronavirus?
Yeah, well, I'll start out. Right now, we have obviously some significant public health concerns regarding the coronavirus, and it is a respiratory illness. And that is the prime concern we have around the world right now. And the fact that the White House is now rolling back emission reductions for industrial soot, for mercury and toxics coming from oil and coal powered plants, and also tailpipe emission standard reductions. This is a particularly cruel act by the administration at this time. So we would like, we're essentially calling for a ceasefire at the White House on rolling back all public health and environmental standards during this pandemic.
And this rollback of regulations happens amid the coronavirus, just at the end of March, right?
That's right. So some of these have been taking place over a period of months, but they're all now coming to final conclusion right now. So we're just asking for a halt until we can figure out what's going on in the country regarding the public's health, not exacerbated by putting more pollutants into the air.
Well, this might be kind of I don't know, a facilities question, but is there any crossover between stay-at-home advisories and so maybe these factories shutting down, even though their regulations have been loosened? Have factories?
Not all the factories are shutting down. We certainly have energy. I mean, we have our electricity on, so we have natural gas fire plants, sometimes oil and coal backing them up. So their particulates, the soot is still being produced, but we don't need them increased, and that's what we're calling for right now, just to back off and lessening those standards. And certainly we're seeing less air pollution in the cities with less automobiles, which are 40% of our emissions right now, and with cars and trucks and emissions at a low level on the highways, we see a temporary reduction in our carbon emissions right now, but that's temporary. That will start right back up when our economy gets back up and running.
Mm.
I thought it was weird when I saw the Los Angeles skyline from my backyard today for the first time. Because I lived out there for a while, and the only thing I could see was my asthma kicking in. So it's been weird. Have there been any other sort of environmental beneficial side effects since the outbreak?
Sam?
Well, I mean, I've just been reading the same stuff that everybody else has, but clearly, wildlife emissions reductions, you're talking about seeing animals in places in municipal and industrial areas that you haven't seen them for decades. I think Venice was the first one to come out with a report, Venice, Italy, with animals showing up that people haven't seen for, a long time. So it's just more evidence that nature bounces back pretty quickly if you get a chance. I just wanted to say that the quick reading I've done on emissions reduction, and Jack is really the go-to person on this, he's more current with it, is this is really the result of industrial size shutdowns. These are not because has, large sectors of carbonized industrial manufacturing economy have found in places like China. That's why you're getting 25 and 30% reductions, not because people aren't driving to work or flying around in airplanes. It's a relatively smaller reduction.
Sam, could you just say that again, because your audio broke up a little bit, and I know it's important.
Yeah, I'm just saying that the reason you're seeing these big drop-offs of 25 to 30% in emissions reductions is because large chunks of manufacturing have shut down, non-essential manufacturing, certainly not power plants, but, manufacturing that are high intensity carbon uses. So, the question has been kicked around, what's it going to be like afterwards? Is it going to make much difference when we go back to work? I tend to agree with Jack that in order to get real change on the ground and sustain these kind of cuts, you have to really look at decarbonizing the economy quickly. And that's a question and something that's been pretty clearly established. We have to switch over to renewable sources to power stuff if you want to get significant climate change, positives like what we're seeing now. You can't hand it off to people on their individual commutes or travel or personal habits. It's going to be large scale decarbonization of the economy is what's going to make it work.
So Sam raises a real good point, and the air quality improvements we're seeing now, that can happen if we do decarbonize the economy and get off fossil fuels.
Right. And I know the Trump administration has really pushed back on emissions, particularly in California. He's sort of penalizing that state, right, for having.
Right, the tailpipe reduction emissions that we see in California that have resulted in a cleaner skyline in Los Angeles. And 12 states have also adopted the tailpipe emissions that California has, and the administration's trying to reverse that. And this will cause significant asthma problems and problems with kids and breathing, especially in the urban areas, the cities, Boston, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia.
So returning to the impact of pollution on COVID, have you read literature that says that this is significant and in areas where there's heavy pollution, people will suffer more?
We don't see any relationship between COVID and climate change, but we do see, we see the fact that the science was ignored for the first 2 months by the administration when the World Health Organization announced January 5th that this was an oncoming pandemic, and then an emergency later in the month was announced by the World Health Organization. And the administration refused to believe the science, just as it refuses to believe the science on climate change. So what we're seeing now is kind of a future scenario of what we're going to see with the impacts of climate change over the next 50 years.
When you say that, you mean what we're seeing now in terms of the response to science, or the people suffering with?
Well, people suffering, especially as a result of droughts and fires, hotter days, larger storms, heat waves, and accelerated sea level rise, which is significant for those of us that live in coastal Massachusetts. And so these things that scientists are telling the administration about now are going to happen. And certainly we'll see the habitat range for mosquitoes and what are considered exotic diseases like dengue fever and zinke and those sorts of things will expand over the next few decades.
Mm. And what is the status of the Paris Agreement right now? I know we are not part of that, but could you give us an update on what other countries are doing?
All countries, except the United States, are moving forward the Paris Climate Agreement. And in the United States, the states are, including the States Alliance. So we have states, cities, and towns, regions like the Northeast, states banding together to comply with the Paris Climate Agreement, irrespective of what the White House has said.
Mm. And what sorts of actions are they taking as an alliance in this country?
Sam, do you want to talk about Reggie?
Well, yeah, we've got an ongoing effort in the Northeast to reduce emissions, somewhat similar to what we've already got in place with power plant reductions in terms of around transportation. Jack, you probably have the most up-to-date.
Yep, there's Massachusetts.
It's basically a carbon exchange. Go ahead.
Yes, the Transportation Carbon Initiative. We have 12 states, including Massachusetts, all the way down through Maryland, Virginia, have banded together to reduce our carbon emissions from the transportation sector.
And has there been any opposition from the White House? Because I know they interfered with the California regulations, right?
Right, and as we're hearing from governors today, the White House does have limited authority over what the states can do, especially in this regard. So the states can come together and look at reducing carbon emissions that from the fuel sector in these states, and that's what the states are doing now. So there's been no input from the administration on this.
Mm.
Yeah, I believe that California, correct me if I'm wrong, Jack, was given exemption under the original Clean Air Act to set their own emission standards for cars, right? And that's been sort of a waiver they've been granted by the feds for a long time, and that's been
Right.
challenged by Trump, right?
That's right. That's a separate set of regulations where the EPA gave California a waiver under the Clean Air Act, as Sam said, to set a higher tailpipe emission standard that other states have copied. So that's one thing, but in that regulation comes out of the administration. When we talk about reducing carbon emissions from the transportation sector, we're looking at putting a price on carbon to reduce the amount of fuel that's used and purchased at the pump. And that's what the Transportation Carbon Initiative is. So there's a number of things the states are doing right now to get emissions reduction.
So before we end, anything important we should all know about climate change, particularly at this particular time?
I would say that because of the fact that the White House still calls climate change a hoax, and that the Congress is not doing anything, it's up to the states and the cities and towns to take the action. And that's the kind of work that Sam was doing at the local level in getting cities and towns to look at mitigation and adaptation when it comes to climate change.
Yeah, maybe we can cover that another time, but both Gloucester and Rockport have become certified communities under the state's municipal vulnerability preparedness program. They both held a couple of very dynamic workshops about a year and a half ago, going back into 2018 or so, with specific actions that are actually being followed up by both communities at this time, although not right now as we speak. So the state has been active there, been a number of communities, obviously coastal communities that have gotten involved with that. I also need to mention that I am no longer actually with MEPC. So yeah, you should note that I'm just a dedicated participant in the Cape Ann Climate Action Network, and happy to be here just offering as a volunteer right now. So.
Well, we can't let you go without having you tell us what those actions are in Rockport and Gloucester.
Sure, just a couple of examples. And I know that in Gloucester, there were a number of recommendations that they've begun working on. I know that the planning department is looking at updating its zoning regulations for climate resiliency improvements, particularly in coastal flood zones. They've been active there. They are completing one of the top concerns at the workshop, because Gloucester has so much beautiful open space and is so reliant on its surface water supplies. There's great concern that the watershed in West Gloucester be studied and managed for forest protection going forward. And I believe that study should be near completion. Another piece around infrastructure, obviously the wastewater treatment plant. I know that the DPW is looking carefully at options there going out to 2050 long term. I don't know exactly what they are, but I do know that the city is ongoing in a project to increase flood protection for the high school as well along the Blinman Canal. That's a project that's probably stalled right now, but I believe has either close to going out to bid or will be going out to bid to raise the height of flood barrier protection along the high school side. Of course, you know, all of these are stopgap measures as we're looking at, I mentioned, Jack, you know, depending on what scenario, we're in a fairly high inclination scenario. So that means at least a couple of feet of sea level rise by 2050. So, and maybe up to 6 feet by 2100. So these are very serious questions. Of just to touch on Rockport for a second. I'm sorry, I jumped off case for a second. So for Rockport actions, they are very concerned. They want to conduct a comprehensive town-wide sea level rise and resiliency study with an emphasis on mapping all threatened structures and infrastructure within the town. They're particularly concerned with educating the community regarding emergency management response. And something that came out of that workshop is that they want to work really closely with Gloucester to do that on a Cape Ann-wide way. It's it's a little, as you know, that's part of who we are. But Cape Ann communities, I think you can safely say, will be working much more closely on these things going forward.
So Heather, this is a good example of how we're dealing with climate change in Massachusetts, reducing heat trapping carbon pollution, and at the same time living with its impacts through the mitigation work Sam does.
Mm. Well, thank you. This has really been informative, and I realize that climate change is not contained to these 2 months of COVID, and it'll be interesting to see what happens after, when people get back in their cars. Although it sounds like that won't make too much of a difference, right? It sounds like the big problem you're talking about is the large industrial carbon producers, right? And around.
Right. Automobiles, buses, trucks, it's 40% of our heat trapping carbon pollution in the Northeast. So it's still a big deal we have to take care of.
Right, right.
Yeah, I'm talking, large scale. We have to shift from carbon source economy to a renewable economy if we want to make a real dent in this going forward. But Jack's absolutely right. I don't mean to discourage people. 40% of our emissions do come from getting around, but we're just one country, and there's enormous opportunities, and people see them clearly. We do have the ability now to go towards a more renewably based economy. We just need to get there, find the political will, and move forward on it.
I have to ask, do you feel as if the political will, I know the political will was there 4 years ago. Do you feel like we were on the right track and it could have happened?
That's one for Jack. He knows.
I think 4 years ago in the White House, we were on the right track. I think the Congress was heading in the right direction. But I think as things stalled, the states took over and took the lead. California and Massachusetts being the most significant in terms of passing legislation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to promote renewable efficiencies. Massachusetts, for 9 years in a row, has been the most energy conservation and efficient state in the nation.
Well, on that note, let's let's hear it from Massachusetts. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for talking to us about this. And I think we have good leadership in this state. I will echo you. So,
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
If people want to learn more about Mass Audubon, how can they do that?
www.massaudubon.org.
Okay. And Sam, for something local, for people who want to follow with you in your initiative, what do you recommend?
Let's see. Probably the easiest way is, gosh, I don't know if we actually have a common contact point yet, but I can look around and follow up with you guys.
Yeah, we can just leave a link here within the video. So.
Yeah, we don't actually, do we have a Cape Ann? I would just Google in Cape Ann Climate Action Network, and I think that there is something set up on that.
Okay, perfect.
Great.
thank you very much, gentlemen. Really appreciate it.
Thank you
Okay.
so much.
you.
Be well.
Be
Bye.
well. Take care.